Closer defence ties between EU countries. Are participating nations taking steps towards an EU army? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. EU defence ministers have recently signed off on 17 joint military projects, all part of a wider plan to develop some kind of defence pact for EU countries. Are they perhaps, though, treading on NATO's toes? Where does that leave Britain? A defence pact to bolster the security of the European Union, allowing its militaries to align more closely.
This is the beginning of a common work. We are definitely turning an historic moment in European defence.
The first defence projects for the 25 participating countries have been agreed. But could they undermine NATO?
With opportunity comes risk. The risk of duplicating what NATO is already doing.
And what would this closer relationship mean for Britain, soon to be out of the European Union? The EU's Permanent Structured Cooperation Plan, as it's called, PESCO, aims to bring EU militaries under one umbrella. Combined EU forces were first proposed 70 years ago, but the UK was against the idea. With Britain now out of the equation and America looking inward, there is a renewed effort to press on. 25 of the EU's 28 member states have signed up to the defence agreement. Its advocates say that EU military missions can be effective where NATO cannot, because EU missions could get support from NATO's rivals, such as India and China. The eventual aim of EU's military integration is to deploy forces together and develop military capabilities, backed by a multi-billion euro fund for research. Are these incremental steps towards a common EU army? 22 of the 28 EU countries are already part of NATO, so what is the point of yet another military alliance? There is criticism that further EU military integration risks duplicating NATO's operations.
They will really be the losers if they end up with two competing structures with two competing capability targets.
The majority of EU countries already fail to give NATO 2% of their GDP, a requirement of membership. Critics have questioned why they are now planning to give money to other defence initiatives. And questions are being asked about what an EU military force would look like after losing its second biggest army, Britain. Is the EU slowly building its own army? Would it ever rival NATO? Or does it simply want a more unified Europe? And I'm very pleased to say that joining us via Skype from Paris, we have Emmanuel Dupuy, President of the Institute for European Perspective and Security here at the Roundtable, John Mills, Chairman of Labour Leave, Julia Himmrich, who's part of the Dahrendorf Forum, a research group which debates Europe, as part of London School of Economics, and Samir Puri, a war studies lecturer at King's College London. Since your subject, Samir, is war, are we seeing here a creep towards an eventual European army?
Well, the European Union has got many virtues and many weaknesses, and a lot of those weaknesses are very pronounced in its personality as a security actor. Ultimately, it doesn't really have the branding. And even as the European security, I guess, atmosphere, if you like, becomes a much colder one than it was in 10, 20 years ago, the European Union, I think its virtues will be in pooling defence resources. That means allowing the national militaries of the EU member states to cooperate and fuse resources, probably to task, rather than the construction of EU-level, federal-level institutions to harmonise defence planning.
See, I'm not sure whether that's a yes or a no. Are we seeing the first steps towards a European army?
No, the European army is entirely hypothetical.
OK. John, hypothetical, does that allay any fears you have of perhaps this undermining NATO and Britain's defence role?
I think there is a danger that setting up a European army, if it was to happen, would undermine NATO, although I must say I share the view that it's going to be very difficult to get this done. But I do think that it is the case that the expenditure on military activity in Europe is very low. I think, quite honestly, President Trump, whatever else you may think of him on different subjects, has got a point in saying that Europe's done too little for too long. But I think in terms of doing more, it'd be better to make a bigger contribution to NATO than it would be to risk fracturing NATO by setting up a separate organisation.
Okay, well, in what sense are people worried about this when it comes to perhaps challenging NATO's supremacy?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to see that there's a worry there could be a separate EU army in some way. And that's not really what either PESCO that we just spoke about or any of the other initiatives from the EU, for example, the European Defence Fund, the EDF, actually aim for. What they do want is to actually improve European capabilities. And as John just said, there's obviously the whole issue about European spending on defense, right? And NATO is very keen then that all its allies should spend 2%. But NATO is also a very small organization. It can't put that kind of pressure and organization on its allies to tell them how to spend, where to spend, how to invest. So what the EU is trying to do is to actually give incentives to spend together, develop together, buy together. And that's why you have things like PESCO and the European Defence Fund that is supposed to be a process to really get the Europeans not just to spend more, but also become more effective. Because what we've seen in recent years is that the EU, or most European member states, still rely way too much on the US and also on the UK, of course. So the fear is...
And without the UK in Europe, how is this perhaps going to work?
Well, it's what do you mean in terms of the...
In terms of if the UK military is not part of it.
Yeah, obviously that would be... There's those two sides to it, right? On the one hand, all of this integration was not really possible until the UK was still a very committed member state. Now, a lot has happened since there has been the Brexit vote, and a lot has moved forward since then. But at the same time, obviously, Europeans want to collaborate with the UK. They're very keen on having Britain involved, but it will be difficult for the UK to do so if they're not paying into the European budget, because the European Commission is willing to put a lot of money on the table now. Another thing that NATO can't do, they can ask people to spend more, but they don't have any money to actually provide.
To Paris and Emmanuel Dupuy, European perspective and security. In what way do those people, those countries that are going to be part of this, and we must leave out, let's say, Denmark and Malta, the UK is a separate issue. Leave out Denmark and Malta, but you've got all the other countries. In what way do they think this is going to help with security?
Well, it's going to help to prepare the future, because there's a lot of perspective in regards to the building of the new generation, of the fifth or the sixth generation of a European jet fighter. If we don't have the capability to work together, that is France and Germany, which are working on the project of the future combat aircraft system, we will have to buy it from our partners in regards to what was mentioned. Of course, the Americans, which represent 70% of the totality of the budget of the European country. And there's a lot of perspective to build the next generation of combat system that we need on the ground, as lots of European armies are operating on the ground. European Union, as per se, is dedicated 3,000 soldiers in regard to European mission. But of course, we do have in mind, and I'm speaking from Paris, that France is engaged in a certain number of operations in Sahel with some European partners, Germany.
Sahel being part of the North African desert area, yeah.
In Sahel and Sahara.
Yeah.
And I think what PESCO will provide is to build future capability. And in regards to that, we have to take in consideration what was brought together, the program called JEDI, Joint European Disruptive Initiative, which will allow the European to build a robust European security by itself without being obliged to buy materials from our partners, again, United States or materials abroad.
Samir, help us with the major issues in terms of security and offence and defence that are facing the European Union now that makes them feel the need to do something like this.
Yeah, I mean, viewers will be very aware of the wide range of threats that European countries face. Of course, there's turmoil in North Africa and the Middle East in terms of state failure. There's migration. There's domestic terrorism inspired by ISIS. There's, of course, the fracture potentially with the transatlantic relationship due to the election of Trump. But just picking up on some of the comments from my co-panelists here, every entity has got its own personality, if you like. And the European Union's personality is quite bureaucratic. We've heard an alphabet soup of acronyms already, which is the way in which the EU expresses.
We've had Jedi from Star Wars, we've had Pesco
indeed.
from fish supermarkets, or whatever.
The Jedi in the Sahara and everything else. So what we're really bringing that all together, what we're talking about here is an institution that was built around economic and financial cooperation in terms of its early history, not defence. NATO is much more direct. It is about a military alliance that is able to project deterrence. And if I offer this observation, one of the EU's major foreign policy successes is its own enlargement. The irony is, to defend that enlargement, it's NATO deterrence that is the thing that kicks into gear. So when we look at the relative contribution to two institutions, they are completely different, potentially complementary, because actually there isn't a great deal the EU can do in terms of projecting that aggressive sense of physical military deterrence.
John, you're part of Labour Leave. You wanted Britain out of the European Union. It's probably going to happen. Outside of Europe, with quite a big military in relative terms, are we going to be at a disadvantage in the UK by not perhaps signing up to something like this? Which would be impossible because we're not in it, but I mean...
Well, I think that what Britain needs to do after leaving the European Union is to cooperate with the other member states on a very wide range of issues. And I would have thought military cooperation was certainly one of them. And Britain has got more effective military forces probably than any other country in Europe, except possibly France. I think the other countries in Europe, most of them are really pretty denuded of effective military forces, and clearly this current initiative is to try and remedy that to some extent. But I mean, I think Europe needs the British contribution, and Britain is willing to put this forward. So it seems to me the sensible thing to do is for Britain to stay in cooperation. I'm sure when we do this, though, that we will want to try and avoid NATO being weakened, because I think this is the big danger about the European army concept.
See, I'm just wondering, it is just a concept, I'm wondering how a pact which involves, its first two projects are to do with medical aid and radio communications, how that's going to stop Russia perhaps invading Crimea?
Well, I think the answer is it won't, but I mean, I do think as a building block, this makes some sense. I think the other thing that clearly Europe could do would be to rationalise procurement to some extent, although that's very difficult because all the various constituent countries don't want to see their arms industries being denuded of orders. There obviously are huge problems of coordination and trying to get better value for money. And
Yeah.
I think that we ought to do what we can to help on all this. But again, I keep coming back to this, not at the expense of fracturing the Western Union by pulling out of NATO.
But John has a point
it.
here, doesn't he? If you've got 26 countries, each one of which makes its nuts and bolts in a different way,
Exactly.
and you're talking about fixing tanks that are operating in different theatres, you've effectively got to start from the beginning.
You don't, well, it is going to be a long road. I mean, you mentioned tanks. I think there's 17 different tanks in the EU compared to the US as one model. And that's a huge issue for NATO as well. And I think what's important is to think about this whole idea of a single set of forces as well. We have the same forces committed to from the member states or allies for NATO or the EU. So NATO would only benefit from greater integration that we see between the European militaries, which are, as you say, compared to France and the UK, very weak and not really able to act. So you have, even in Eastern Europe, countries from the Baltic countries, it's really difficult for them to just speak to each other because they use different radios. Which
is
really
why I mentioned the radio thing as sort of slightly facetiously, but it is vital, isn't it?
Yeah, it is vital, and it is actually. That's why, even though the EU is very bureaucratic, NATO also has a lot of acronyms. I don't know if you've ever looked at their defense planning
We'll start
programs.
at the beginning with NATO.
But basically, these are things that NATO can benefit from. And I agree that there needs to be a close cooperation between the UK and the EU, and also between NATO and the EU. I wouldn't see this as potentially a threat to NATO.
Okay, I'll throw this one out there, and anybody jump in on it. I mean, if it's of benefit to NATO rather than necessarily a threat to NATO, how do you prevent it being more of the positive side rather than the negative side?
I think, just to throw one more acronym out there and picking up on Julia's point, EU TAC, European Union Tactical Airlift Centre in Zaragoza. It's another example, it's opened just last year, of pooling resources, tactical airlift, clearly. Obviously, with budget-stretched European countries, it makes a lot of sense to do this. So really, I think the complementary side is stimulating the economics and the financial common sense around pooling, which NATO can actually benefit from. If we have more generations of US defense secretaries asking for the 2% minimum defense spend GDP, there is a realistic, I guess, counter-argument, which is, well, how are you going to domestically allow those individual European countries to get there? The EU might be a vehicle for some of those EU countries to actually realise that in a collaborative way, because independently they won't have the ability to, I think, generate some of these capabilities just from scratch as self-sustaining capabilities.
Are we really talking about this, and do jump in on the question I asked, really because of the mess that was made of what happened, Emmanuel, this one, the mess that was made in Libya in 2011?
Well, of course, Libya is a laboratory of what should have been European cooperation. It was at the outskirts of Europe. It was engaging European elements. It was a European issue, and I want to raise this and try to respond to the question you mentioned about whether or not it would be better, as it was mentioned during the Munich Security Conference, to have a European pillar inside NATO, a stronger European pillar inside NATO, or to build a robust European capability. As a French, I have to say that there's been an evolution inside the French debate on that question. Emmanuel Macron made it quite clear, he made a speech in Sorbonne, that PESCO is not only what you mentioned. PESCO is building the next generation of European defense and security capability. What European Union missions can do, what it has been done during the 11th mission, which was engaged starting in 2003, was to train and to mentor and to equip a certain number of military partners, which NATO does not want to do. When it comes to having the necessity to fight against terrorist actors inside our countries and outside of our countries, we need to have a strong, robust, quick reaction.
John, let me ask you, with Britain outside the European Union, something which you are in favour of, do you think a bloc of 26, 27 countries making this sort of decision is going to work in any way, shape or form?
I think around the edges it will probably improve things. Whether it's going to make a quantitative difference or a qualitative difference, really, to the way that defence is organised in Europe, I think it's a very open question. And I agree that Europe's got lots of external threats at the moment, which it's not well geared up to respond to. So I think anything that can improve Europe's ability to respond to these events is welcome. I'm just not very sure that what's happening at the moment is going to make more than a marginal difference.
So the suggestion was made that this could actually benefit NATO rather than hurt NATO. How would that?
I think
how would the hurt be avoided?
I think it depends to some extent on what the reason for the initiative is. I mean, I think that there's always been a bit of a tendency in the European Union to take steps to build a sort of European nation state. And, you know, it's got a parliament and it's got an anthem and all this sort of thing. And, you know, states have armies, and so the EU wants to have an army. I mean, I think there's an element of that to it, which is unfortunate, because I think that will pull Europe away from NATO. I think there are dangers that the United States is going to be less committed to NATO than it has been up till now. And I think anything that leads to this sort of centripetal forces is something we want to avoid.
You see, it could end up, perhaps, as John is suggesting, with the United States saying, well, look, you've got your own bag of tricks to play with. You've decided that you don't really need us. Why should we bother?
It's an interesting dynamic, right? On the one hand, the US wants Europe to spend more, to do more, and they think in this whole NATO logic of we're carrying 50% of the burden and you should carry 50% of the burden. But there's obviously some reluctance in accepting this whole idea of strategic autonomy within Europe. So what do you do outside of NATO operations? What do you do beyond that, right? So it is a difficult, it's always been a tense tension in that relationship. But I would say that, just to follow up on something that John said in regards to an EU army, what we do need to remember is that no president of the European Council is going to declare war on anyone or send troops anywhere. This is still going to be decided by domestic governments, and mostly parliaments have an important role to play there.
What happens if you have a disagreement that becomes bellicose between two European country members? What happens then? Because no president's going to declare war, but you might have de facto war between two European countries.
You mean EU members?
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole other issue, right?
Yeah, but then what happens?
But they still all have their national militaries, right?
Yeah.
So the integration is not at the level that you have, there's just going to be one single army.
But it's an alphabet soup. If we go back to the acronyms from earlier, if you suddenly have sort of national armies fighting national armies and you have a supranational defence force that's trying to sort this out, it's a right muddle, isn't it?
Well, so fishing through the alphabet soup, something that you end up doing is forum shopping, which is if there's a crisis, this is the point you're making, if there's a crisis, what is the crisis? It's in the Sahara, for example. You find the right multilateral forum for that mission. And there is, I think, a lot of virtue in the EU platform, if you like, for doing sort of stabilisation work in Europe's near and abroad, because it's a relatively benign platform. It's not as aggressive as NATO. There might be issues around terrorism or migration that could be built into a stabilisation mission, thinking about the Libyas, if you like, of the world, where it is the appropriate one. Now, switching focus to Russia, clearly the EU carries no credibility whatsoever as a deterrent platform. And that's where, to answer your initial question, it's about comparative advantage, finding the right platform for the right task, and also working out where to minimise the potential, the potential for them to actually undo each other, which is, of course, is Vladimir Putin's dream, isn't it? Is that there are so many different platforms that the incoherence is something he can take advantage of.
Anybody answer this one? Are we in any way seeing creep, whereby this is perhaps the first step towards something that everybody at the moment is saying is impossible and would never happen, it would never work. But maybe in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it will have become a lot of incremental steps and we'll actually be there.
I think there are probably quite a lot of people in the EU who would like to see this happen. But I agree with you. I think that the difficulties about getting this actually to occur are very substantial. I would be surprised if in 10 years' time there was anything that really resembled a European army.
Okay. Emmanuel, what's the next step? If I'm talking about creep and increments, what is the next step that comes after this PESCO deal?
Well, we have to increase the budget, which is insufficient to bring out concretely what was proposed during the European Council of November. We had an objective to dedicate, by the year 2020, 40 billion of euros in regards to research, development, and investment in defense. We are reaching for only 1.5 billion, which is already a lot, but not, again, sufficient. We have to work on the disruptive capability, because if we do not do so in regards to the future aircraft, European aircraft, in regards, I will throw in two acronyms, the main ground combat system, the European tank of the future, as well as the future artillery system, we will have the obligation to buy it outside of Europe. So we have to work on European partnership, starting from bilateral. We are doing this in regards to the tank and artillery capability with the new consortium built between French and German construction. We have been doing this in regards to the missile capability. This was launched in Great Britain. And we have to do this in an Alten system. And this is what Fincantieri and Naval Group were doing in June.
Emmanuel, okay, leave it. Thank you very much indeed from Paris. We've got a couple of minutes to wrap this up. Let me throw it over to this side of the table and say, any fears that people have at the moment that this might lead to something that they don't want to see? In other words, a European continent united as one army, perhaps for whatever reason. Those fears are groundless?
I think they're groundless because they're associated with a project that isn't actually on the table. I think it's a misunderstanding of what member states are trying to do, is to operate, be more efficient together. But it won't take away the control of national governments or the parliament in deciding where to deploy and what wars to get involved with.
So this will help?
Well, I think your point about 2030s, 2040s, thinking far ahead in the future. Something we didn't have quite time to talk about is the evolution of Germany's personality as a defence actor. And I think that, of course, is history yet to be written, maybe not after Merkel, but maybe two after Merkel in terms of who's running Germany, when the generational link to World War II is gone, and when there might be a different consensus within German politics as to how usable they are as a military actor. That will shape this debate over the EU army, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. It's been a strange conversation in many ways. I appreciate everything you've thrown in, because we're talking about something that doesn't actually exist. Whether it does in the future, Emmanuel, thank you very much from Paris. Whether it does in the future is a matter for other people to debate. I will probably be long retired by that point. Some of our younger panellists may be invited back in 20, 30 years to see what the answer is. But for now, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry I didn't include you, John, in the younger ones, but there we go.
Well, there you go.
Thank you very much for watching Roundtable. From me, David Foster, and the rest of the team. Bye-bye for now.